It was just a family portrait. Until you noticed the father's hand on his daughter's shoulder. The antique shop in Charleston's historic district smelled of old wood and mothballs. Marcus had been photographing inventory for the shop's online catalog when he noticed the framed photograph tucked between a pair of oil paintings. It was a typical Victorian family portrait, the kind he'd documented dozens of times. Formal poses, serious expressions, the distinctive sepia tone of 1870s photography. The photograph showed a family of four, father, mother, and two daughters. The father stood behind his seated wife, one hand resting on the shoulder of the older daughter, who stood beside her mother's chair. The younger daughter sat on her mother's lap. All were dressed in their finest clothing, the fabric quality suggesting middle-class prosperity. Marcus almost moved past it, but something about the composition caught his attention. The father's hand placement seemed deliberate in a way that went beyond typical Victorian formality. His fingers were positioned at an odd angle, almost as if gripping or covering something specific on the girl's shoulder. He purchased the photograph for $35, drawn by professional curiosity. Back in his studio, Marcus placed it under his high-resolution scanner. He specialized in restoring and documenting historical photographs from museums and archives, and had learned that Victorian portraits often revealed hidden details under magnification. He began his systematic examination, scanning the image at 3600 dpi. The family's faces came into sharp focus first. The father appeared to be in his mid-30s, with light brown hair and refined features. The mother was pale-skinned with dark hair arranged in the popular style of the mid-1870s. The daughters, perhaps 8 and 4 years old, had their mother's delicate features, but their father's lighter coloring. Then Marcus zoomed in on the father's hand, where it rested on the older daughter's shoulder. At normal magnification, the positioning had seemed slightly awkward. Under enhancement, he understood why. The father's fingers weren't simply resting on the shoulder. They were deliberately positioned to cover something on the girl's exposed skin, just above the neckline of her dress. Marcus adjusted the contrast and sharpened the image. Between the father's fingers, barely visible, was the edge of what appeared to be a birthmark or skin discoloration. Marcus leaned closer to his screen, studying the pattern. The visible portion showed an irregular pigmentation that the father's hand was clearly meant to conceal. He'd seen enough Victorian photographs to know this positioning wasn't accidental. Portrait photographers of that era were meticulous about hand placement and posture. This father had specifically arranged his hand to hide this mark. But why? Birthmarks weren't uncommon or particularly stigmatized in Victorian America. People didn't typically hide them in formal portraits, unless there was something about this particular mark that needed concealing. Marcus examined the rest of the photograph more carefully, looking for context clues. The studio backdrop showed painted columns and drapery typical of the period. On the back of the photograph, partially obscured by the frame's backing, he could see faint handwriting. He carefully removed the photograph from its frame. The inscription read, "The Patterson Family, Charleston, South Carolina, April 1875. Patterson. Charleston. 1875. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Charleston in 1875 was just 10 years after the end of the Civil War, in the middle of Reconstruction. The city was navigating enormous social upheaval, particularly regarding race relations. He looked again at the birthmark the father was covering, at the family's careful positioning, at the formality that now seemed less about Victorian propriety and more about careful presentation. Something about this photograph wasn't what it appeared to be. Marcus needed to know who the Patterson family was, and why that father had been so careful to hide his daughter's birthmark from the camera's permanent record. Marcus spent the evening searching Charleston historical records. The Patterson surname was common, but paired with the 1875 date and the photograph's clear indication of middle-class status, he could narrow his search. The Charleston City Directory from 1875 listed 3 Patterson families. 2 were listed in the colored section. Charleston's directories segregated entries by race during this period. 1 Patterson family appeared in the main section. Patterson, James, clockmaker, 47 King Street. A clockmaker would have had the income to afford a professional family portrait. Marcus searched property records and found that James Patterson had purchased a small building on King Street in 1871, establishing his clockmaking and repair business there. Tax records showed steady, modest prosperity through the 1870s and 1880s, but when Marcus searched census records, he hit something strange. The 1870 census, taken just before James purchased his business, showed no Patterson family in Charleston matching this description. It was as if the family had appeared suddenly in 1871. Marcus widened his search to surrounding areas in neighboring states. In the 1870 census for Columbia, South Carolina, about 100 miles inland, he found an entry that made his breath catch. Patterson, James, colored, laborer, age 28. The entry listed a wife, Sarah, white, age 24, and 1 daughter, Ruth, age 3. The racial designation was explicit. James was listed as colored, Sarah as white, and Ruth as mulatto. Old and Marcus sat back from his computer, his mind racing. A mixed-race family in Colombia in 1870. Then, in 1871, a James Patterson, now with no racial designation, appears in Charleston with a clockmaking business. By 1875, when the photograph was taken, they were presenting as a white middle-class family. He searched for more records. James Patterson's business license application from 1871, which he accessed through the Charleston Historical Society's digitized archives, listed him simply as James Patterson with no racial designation. His signature on the document was educated, confident. In South Carolina in 1871, a man designated as colored would have faced enormous obstacles in establishing a business, obtaining credit, finding customers. But a white clockmaker could build a respectable trade. Marcus looked at the photograph again, understanding now flooding through him. James Patterson hadn't been hiding a simple birthmark. He'd been covering evidence that might reveal his daughter's mixed-race heritage, evidence that could destroy the new identity his family had carefully constructed. The practice was called passing, light-skinned black individuals living as white to escape discrimination and violence. It required constant vigilance, perfect performance, and the willingness to sever all connections to one's past and community. That hand on the shoulder wasn't just paternal affection. It was protection, concealment, and a father's desperate attempt to secure his daughter's future in a society that would have destroyed her if it knew the truth. Marcus needed to know more. What had driven James Patterson to make this choice? How had the family managed it? And what had become of Ruth, the daughter whose birthmark her father had so carefully hidden? He searched for birth records, death certificates, property transfers, any trail the Patterson family had left. What he found suggested a story of remarkable courage, constant fear, and the extraordinary lengths parents would go to protect their children from an unjust world. Marcus drove to Columbia the following week to access records not yet digitized. At the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, he found documents that began to fill in James Patterson's early life. James had been born enslaved in 1842 on a plantation outside Columbia. The plantation records, preserved because of a long legal dispute over the property, showed that James's mother was an enslaved woman named Betty, and his father was listed as unknown, a common designation that often meant the father was the enslaver or another white man. Betty had been a house servant, and James, being light-skinned, had worked inside as well. Crucially, he'd been taught to read and write by the enslaver's children, illegal in South Carolina, but practiced secretly in some households. He'd also been apprenticed informally to a clockmaker who visited the plantation regularly. After emancipation in 1865, James had remained in Columbia, working as a laborer while building a reputation for clock repair. The Freedmen's Bureau records showed he'd registered to vote in 1867 and had attended meetings of the local Republican Club, public assertions of his identity as a free black man. Then Marcus found the marriage record. James Patterson and Sarah Mitchell, married June 1866. The record noted Sarah was white, daughter of a poor farmer who died during the war. Interracial marriages were legal in South Carolina briefly during Reconstruction, though deeply controversial. A researcher named Dr. Angela Wright, who specialized in Reconstruction-era South Carolina, helped Marcus understand the context. Mixed-race marriages drew enormous hostility, she explained. Even though they were legal, families faced violence, economic boycotts, social ostracism. Many couples had to leave their communities. Is that why they eventually moved to Charleston and changed their racial designation? Marcus asked. Dr. Wright nodded. Charleston was larger, more anonymous, and if you were light-skinned enough, you could sometimes establish yourself with new documentation that didn't include racial markers. It was dangerous. Being caught meant violence, possibly death. But for some families, it seemed safer than staying in places where everyone knew their background. Marcus found records of violence against mixed-race families in Columbia during the early 1870s. One newspaper article from 1870 described attacks on several households, including the burning of a home belonging to a Negro man living with a white woman. 3 months after that article, James had sold his few possessions in Columbia. The family had disappeared from local records. They resurfaced in Charleston in 1871, with James establishing his business license simply as James Patterson, his race unspecified. Charleston's city directories from that period didn't automatically include racial designations for everyone, unlike the census, which required them. If you owned property, ran a business, and presented as white, you could often be listed without the colored notation. It required careful performance, living in white neighborhoods, attending white churches, avoiding any association with black community institutions. Marcus found James Patterson's business address and discovered the building still stood, now a tourist shop. The clockmaker's shop had occupied the ground floor. The family had lived upstairs. The location was in a respectable working-class white neighborhood, far from the areas where Charleston's black community concentrated. Dr. Wright pulled up maps showing residential patterns. Living here, James would have had to completely sever ties with other black families. His daughters would have attended white schools. The family would have worshipped at white churches. Any connection to the black community would have exposed them. What about the birthmark? Marcus asked. Why would that have been so dangerous? Certain physical markers were used to prove black ancestry, Dr. Wright explained. Skin discoloration, hair texture, facial features. White people obsessed over these details. A birthmark with irregular pigmentation might have been read as evidence of mixed ancestry, especially if someone already suspected the family's background. Marcus showed her the photograph, pointing out how deliberately James's hand covered the mark. Dr. Wright studied it carefully. He's protecting her, she said softly. This photograph would have been displayed in their home, seen by customers and neighbors. It's evidence of their respectable family status, but if that birthmark were visible, someone might have questioned it, investigated further. He couldn't risk it. Marcus understood now the constant tension the Patterson family must have lived under. Every photograph, every public appearance, every interaction carried the risk of exposure and catastrophic consequences. Marcus needed to find out what happened to Ruth Patterson, the daughter in the photograph. He returned to Charleston records, searching for her through the 1880s and 1890s. The 1880 census listed the Patterson family still at the King Street address. Ruth was now 13, and a younger sister, Margaret, appeared, born in 1877, 2 years after the photograph. Both girls were listed with no racial designation, recorded as daughters of James and Sarah Patterson. Charleston city directories showed Ruth Patterson working as a teacher at a private girls' academy in 1892, when she would have been 25. Teaching positions in white schools were completely unavailable to anyone known to be black, so Ruth's employment confirmed the family had successfully maintained their white identity for over 2 decades. Then, in 1894, Marcus found a marriage announcement in the Charleston News and Courier. Miss Ruth Patterson, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Patterson of King Street, was united in marriage to Mr. William Hendricks, merchant of Savannah, Georgia, on Saturday evening at St. Philip's Episcopal Church. St. Philip's was one of Charleston's oldest and most prestigious white churches. Ruth's marriage there, to a merchant from a respectable Georgia family, showed how completely she'd been integrated into white Southern society. Marcus searched Savannah records next. William Hendricks ran a successful dry goods store. City directories showed the couple living in a comfortable middle-class neighborhood. Between 1895 and 1905, Ruth gave birth to 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The family appeared thoroughly established in Savannah's white community. William served on the Chamber of Commerce. Ruth was active in church activities and charitable organizations. Their children attended good schools, but Marcus found something else. A series of letters preserved in a collection of family papers that William Hendricks' great-grandson had donated to the Georgia Historical Society. Marcus traveled to Savannah to read them. The letters were correspondence between Ruth and her sister Margaret, who had remained in Charleston. Most discussed mundane domestic matters, but certain passages revealed the psychological weight Ruth carried. June 1898. Sometimes I wake at night terrified that someone will discover the truth about us. William knows nothing of my childhood before Charleston, and I cannot tell him. What would he do if he knew? What would become of our children? March 1901. Father's hands shake now from the years of detailed clockwork. I remember how steady they were when I was a child, how carefully he positioned them in that photograph. He taught me that survival sometimes requires hiding parts of yourself, but the cost is living with constant fear. November 1905. My daughter Clara asked about her grandparents today. I showed her the family portrait from 1875. She remarked on how grandfather's hand rests on my shoulder, said it looked protective. If only she knew how literally true that was. That his hand was protecting me then and still protects me now, by hiding what must remain hidden. Marcus sat with these letters for hours, moved by Ruth's isolation. She'd built a successful life, married well, had children who would never face the discrimination she'd been born into. But the price was living a lie, never being fully known even by her own husband and children. He found Ruth's obituary from 1943. She died at 76, survived by her husband, 4 children, and 11 grandchildren. The notice described her as a devoted wife, mother, and church member. Nothing in it hinted at the extraordinary courage her life had required or the secret she'd guarded for nearly 7 decades. Marcus wondered about Ruth's children and grandchildren. Did any of them know the truth? Were there descendants still living who had no idea their family history included this chapter of passing, of racial boundary crossing, of systematic deception undertaken for survival? Marcus wanted to understand what had driven James Patterson to make the choice to pass as white. He returned to Columbia, searching for more details about the violence that had preceded the family's move to Charleston. At the University of South Carolina's archives, he found newspaper accounts from 1870 and 1871 that painted a disturbing picture. As Reconstruction progressed and black men gained political rights, white supremacist groups had responded with systematic terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations targeted successful black families, particularly those in interracial marriages. One article from October 1870 described an attack on a mixed-race family in Columbia. The house burned, the husband beaten nearly to death, the family driven from town. Marcus found testimony from congressional hearings on Klan violence in South Carolina. Multiple witnesses described attacks specifically aimed at light-skinned black men married to white women, whom white supremacists viewed as particular threats to racial hierarchy. Then Marcus discovered something chilling, a notation in Freedmen's Bureau records from January 1871. An agent had noted, James Patterson, colored, clockmaker, reports threats to his family, wife and child in danger, requesting protection. The notation ended, no protection available, advised to relocate. 2 months later, James had sold everything and moved his family to Charleston. He'd taken Ruth, then 4 years old, and Sarah, who was pregnant with their second child, and had started over, this time carefully obscuring their background to avoid the violence that had driven them out. Marcus found one more document that illuminated James's decision. In the collection of papers from a Reconstruction-era minister, he discovered a letter dated March 1871, written by James to the minister who had married him and Sarah. Reverend Clark, I am writing to inform you that Sarah, Ruth, and I are leaving Columbia. The threats have become too specific, too dangerous. Men have told me explicitly what they will do to my wife and daughter if we remain. I cannot protect them here. I have made a decision that I know you will find troubling. We are going to Charleston, where we are unknown. I'm going to establish us there as a white family. My light skin makes this possible, though it requires denying who I am and where I come from. I know this is deception. I know it means severing all connection to my mother's people and the black community that has supported us. I know I am, in some way, betraying the cause of our race's advancement by hiding rather than standing proud. But, Reverend, I have a 4-year-old daughter. I have seen what they do to children of mixed families. I have heard the threats. I cannot, I will not, let Ruth grow up under that terror. If I can give her a life free from constant fear of violence, from the limitations placed on colored people, from the hatred directed at mixed-race families, then I will do it, whatever the moral cost to me personally. Please pray for us, though I know we do not deserve your prayers for this choice. Pray that Ruth grows up safe, that she never has to know the fear that drives us to this deception. I will not contact you again. Our past must die so that Ruth's future can live, but know that I am grateful for your kindness to us, and I am sorry for what I must do. Marcus sat with this letter for a long time. James Patterson hadn't been simply seeking social advantage or comfort. He'd been a father trying to protect his child in a society that threatened violence against mixed-race families. The 1875 photograph took on new meaning now. That carefully positioned hand wasn't just hiding a birthmark. It represented 4 years of successfully building a new life, of protecting Ruth from the dangers that had driven them from Columbia. The photograph documented their achievement of safety, purchased at the cost of James's identity and community connections. Marcus found more evidence of what James had sacrificed. In Columbia's black community records from the 1870s and beyond, he found references to James Patterson that revealed the relationships he'd severed. A notation from an 1873 meeting of the Colored Union League. James Patterson, formerly of this city, cannot be located. His mother Betty seeks information about her son and his family. Betty, James's mother, had still been alive in Columbia, freed from slavery but now cut off from her son who had disappeared to protect his family. Marcus found her death certificate from 1881. She died in the poorhouse. No family listed. James couldn't have attended his mother's funeral without exposing his family's secret. He'd chosen Ruth's safety over his relationship with his mother. The weight of that choice was almost incomprehensible. Marcus also found that James's sister, Clara, still living in Columbia as a washerwoman, had tried to locate him. A Freedmen's Bureau agent's notes from 1875 recorded, Clara Patterson seeking brother James, last known Charleston, urgent family matter. James hadn't responded. He couldn't. Any connection to his black family in Columbia would have unraveled everything. Dr. Angela Wright helped Marcus understand the broader context. Passing required complete separation, she explained. You couldn't maintain relationships across the color line without arousing suspicion. Black relatives couldn't visit. You couldn't attend their funerals or weddings. You had to treat them as strangers if you encountered them publicly. The isolation must have been devastating, Marcus said. It was survival, Dr. Wright corrected gently. We judge historical choices from our position of safety. James Patterson lived in a time when his daughter could have been killed for being mixed race. He chose her life over his connections. We can mourn what he lost without judging his choice. Marcus found evidence of that isolation in unexpected places. James's business records from the 1880s, preserved because of a legal dispute over a debt, included a notation in his hand. April 14, 1881. The date his mother had died, according to the death certificate Marcus had found. James had known somehow, perhaps through a discreet inquiry, but couldn't acknowledge it publicly. The business ledger showed that on April 15, 1881, James had donated a substantial sum, nearly a month's income, to Charleston's colored orphanage. The donation was listed as anonymous in the orphanage records, but the handwriting on the donation slip matched James' business records. It was the only way he could mark his mother's death, an anonymous donation to help black children, a gesture no one in his white life would question, but that honored the community he'd been forced to abandon. Marcus found similar anonymous donations throughout James's business records, contributions to colored schools, churches, aid societies, always anonymous, always substantial, always given in ways that wouldn't draw attention. James had maintained a secret connection to Black Charleston, helping from a distance the community he couldn't publicly join, but the personal cost was evident. A diary that Margaret, the younger daughter, had kept as a teenager, found in a trunk of family papers, included a puzzling entry from 1892. I found Father in his workshop today, crying. When I asked what was wrong, he said he was remembering someone from long ago. He wouldn't say who. Mother came and took him upstairs. Later, she told me Father sometimes has melancholy days, and I shouldn't trouble him with questions. But I wonder who he was remembering that brought such grief. James had lived a split existence. Publicly, a respectable white clockmaker. Privately, a man haunted by the family and community he'd abandoned. The safety he'd purchased for his daughters had cost him his own sense of belonging. Marcus found something unexpected in Margaret's papers, evidence that the younger daughter had eventually learned the family secret. A letter written in 1920, found among papers donated to the Charleston Historical Society, revealed the moment of discovery. Margaret had married in 1899 and moved to Atlanta. In 1920, at age 43, she'd received a letter from an elderly black woman in Columbia who claimed to be her father's sister, Clara, James' sister, whom he'd been forced to abandon. Clara's letter, preserved with Margaret's response, was heartbreaking. Dear Mrs. Richmond, you do not know me, but I am your Aunt Clara. Your father was my brother James. Before he passed, as white and moved to Charleston, he lived in Columbia with his mother, my mother, and me. When he left, he cut all ties to protect his family. I understood why, though it broke all our hearts. I'm dying now, and before I go, I wanted you and your sister to know that you had a grandmother and an aunt who loved you, even though we could never meet you. Your grandmother, Betty, spoke of you often before she died. She understood why James did what he did. She never blamed him. I'm not writing to cause trouble for you or your family. I will not contact you again if you do not wish it. I simply wanted you to know where you came from, and that you were loved by people you never knew existed. Margaret's response, a draft found in her papers, showed her initial shock and eventual understanding. Dear Mrs. Patterson, your letter has shaken the foundations of everything I thought I knew about my family. I have spent the past week in a state of disbelief, and I must admit anger at my parents for hiding this truth. But as I reflect, I begin to understand. I have 2 daughters. I would do anything to protect them, even things that would cost me dearly. My father chose our safety over his own comfort and connections. That is not a choice I can judge. I wish I could have known my grandmother Betty. I wish I could have known you, but I understand why that was impossible. Please know that I will honor our family's true history, even if I cannot speak of it publicly. Margaret had visited Clara in Columbia before her death, traveling discreetly and telling her husband she was visiting a friend. The experience had changed her understanding of her father's legacy. In a diary entry from 1921, Margaret wrote, I understand now what Father gave up for us. He abandoned his mother, his sister, his entire community, so that Ruth and I could grow up without the terror he and Mother faced. He lived in exile from himself so we could be safe. I look at the family portrait from 1875, that Father's hand on Ruth's shoulder, and I see it differently now. That hand isn't just covering a birthmark. It's carrying the weight of all he sacrificed. Every day he maintained that cover, he was choosing us over himself. Marcus discovered that Margaret had tried to share this history with her own children, but they hadn't wanted to hear it. A letter from her daughter in 1925 responded to Margaret's attempt to explain, Mother, please do not speak of this again. We are a respectable white family. Whatever grandfather's background might have been, it has nothing to do with us now. You risk everything by discussing this, and I will not let you endanger my children's standing in society. Margaret had died in 1951, the secret dying with her. Her children and grandchildren knew nothing of James Patterson's true history, of Betty and Clara, of the extraordinary choice that had shaped their family line. But Margaret had preserved the documents, Clara's letter, her own diary entries, copies of her correspondence, and had donated them anonymously to the Historical Society with instructions they be sealed until 2000. She'd wanted the truth recorded even if her family wouldn't acknowledge it. Marcus faced a difficult decision. Ruth Patterson's descendants, now living as the Hendricks family in Georgia and beyond, had no idea about their family history. Should he contact them? Did they have a right to know, or would revealing this information cause unnecessary pain? He consulted with Dr. Wright and several other historians who specialized in family histories involving racial passing. The consensus was cautious but clear. Descendants deserved to know their true history, but the approach had to be sensitive and careful. Marcus located Ruth's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Emily Hendricks, living in Atlanta. She was in her 50s, a college professor with her own family. Marcus sent a careful letter explaining he was researching Charleston history and had found documents related to her ancestor Ruth Patterson Hendricks. Could they meet to discuss what he'd discovered? Emily agreed, curious about her family history. They met in a coffee shop in Atlanta, where Marcus had brought copies of the photograph, the letters, and documentation he'd gathered. "Before I show you what I found," Marcus said carefully, "I need to tell you this information might be surprising and will definitely change your understanding of your family history. Take whatever time you need with it." He showed her the 1875 photograph first, pointing out how James's hand carefully covered Ruth's shoulder. Then he explained what he'd discovered about the birthmark, about James and Sarah's life in Columbia, about the violence that had driven them to Charleston, about the choice James had made to pass as white. Emily was quiet for a long time, studying the photograph. "You're telling me my great-great-great-grandfather was black? That our family has been passing as white for almost 150 years? "Yes, I have documentation. Census records, letters, testimony. There's no doubt about the facts." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she looked through the documents. Did Ruth know? Did her children? Ruth knew. She wrote about it in letters to her sister. But she never told her husband or children. As far as I can find, only her sister Margaret learned the truth as an adult, and Margaret's children refused to acknowledge it. So for 5 generations, we've been living a lie. Marcus chose his words carefully. You've been living the life your ancestors bought for you at great personal cost. James Patterson gave up his mother, his sister, his community, his identity, so that Ruth could be safe. Ruth lived with constant fear and isolation so her children wouldn't face the discrimination she'd been born into. They weren't lying to you. They were protecting you. Emily's eyes filled with tears. But who am I now? What does this mean for my children? It means you have a more complex history than you knew. It means you're descended from people who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. It means James Patterson loved his daughter so much he was willing to erase himself to save her. Emily looked at the photograph again, at James's careful hand on young Ruth's shoulder. He's protecting her. He's protecting her, Marcus confirmed. From violence, from discrimination, from a society that would have destroyed her for being mixed race. That protection worked. You exist because of his choice. Over the following weeks, Emily grappled with the revelation. She contacted Margaret's descendants, some of whom were shocked and defensive, others curious and open. The family had fractured responses. Some wanted nothing to do with this history. Others wanted to learn more. Emily decided to embrace the truth. She researched Betty and Clara, the family James had been forced to abandon. She found their graves in Columbia and arranged for proper headstones. As Marcus's research became known in historical circles, other descendants of families who had passed began contacting him. Each had discovered similar secrets. Grandparents or great-grandparents who had crossed the color line. Families who had lived as white for generations while hiding black ancestry. A woman from Virginia wrote about finding a photograph where her great-grandfather's features looked suspiciously careful, formal poses designed to obscure rather than reveal. Research confirmed her suspicions. Her family had been passing since the 1880s. Marcus realized the Patterson family wasn't unique. Thousands of light-skinned black families had made similar choices throughout the South during Reconstruction. Some succeeded for generations. Others were exposed and destroyed. Dr. Angela Wright helped Marcus understand the pattern. Passing was more common than most realize. Tens of thousands crossed the color line between 1870 and 1920. It complicates our narratives about race because it shows how artificial those categories were. Emily Hendricks chose to acknowledge her black heritage publicly. She wrote an article for a history journal using real names and documentation. Some family members stopped speaking to her, others thanked her. Emily traveled to Columbia and located descendants of Clara's family, her black cousins living separate lives for over a century. The reunion was complicated, emotional, and ultimately healing. Marcus organized an exhibit at the Charleston Museum. Hidden in plain sight, stories of racial passing in the American South. The centerpiece was the Patterson family photograph, displayed with James's letters, Ruth's correspondence, and testimonies from descendants. The exhibit drew significant attention and controversy, but it revealed an important hidden history that demanded recognition. 6 months after the exhibit opened, Marcus received a letter from Catherine, 94 years old, Ruth Hendricks' granddaughter living in a Savannah nursing home. I am writing because I know things about our family that no one else alive knows. My grandmother, Ruth, told me the truth when I was 16 in 1947. She made me promise not to tell the rest of the family. I've kept that promise for 77 years, but I'm dying soon. Marcus visited Catherine, who showed him a locket containing a daguerreotype of Betty, James Patterson's mother. Ruth never met her, but James gave her this photograph before he died. She kept it hidden her entire life. Catherine revealed Ruth's unsent letters to the black family she'd never known, expressing grief over the separation James's choice had required. She showed Marcus a newspaper clipping from 1875, James' business advertisement featuring the family portrait. The photograph was meant to be public, Catherine explained. It showed Charleston he was respectable. But that hand protecting Ruth, that was his private truth, the way he protected her every day. Marcus updated the exhibit with Catherine's revelations. The Patterson photograph was now displayed with the complete story, James's sacrifice. Betty's photograph finally reunited with her son's family after 150 years. The photograph became an icon of hidden histories brought to light. Emily brought her children to see it. "That's our great-great-great-grandfather," she told them. "He gave up everything so we could exist." For Marcus, the photograph's power remained in that single gesture, a father's hand simultaneously protecting and concealing, loving and lying. It was just a family portrait, until you understood what that father's hand really meant. Then it became a testament to survival, sacrifice, and the extraordinary lengths parents go to protect their children.